Hopefully you can all see that. So as Catherine said, my name is Brandon Pierce. I am a Azure Solutions Specialist here at Bytes. I sit within our Cloud Solutions Specialist team, and my role is to talk about Azure to our customers. If there's a requirement to look at something, or if there's something you want to know more about or how to do it, then that is something that you can discuss with me. And to get hold of me, you'd usually do that through your account manager. So the agenda for today is I'm going to go through a few cloud concepts at a very high level, some cloud adoption strategies, then going through some select Azure services, then some cost optimizations, very high level, some governance and security stuff. That will then be followed by a quantum demo that will be handled by Maria, and after that we'll have that Q&A session. So the cloud concepts. So just to get started on this, cloud computing, so what is it? Obviously it's been around for a while now, but the concept is that it is the ability to quickly procure and utilize services within a solution in the cloud, in somebody else's data center, where traditionally you would have had to gone to the expense of purchasing very expensive hardware, going through procurement process, through installation processes, which could take a significant amount of time to actually procure that and actually get that solution working. By comparison, that cloud computing provides that fast, quick solution to be able to just procure something, to get something up and running much faster than maybe traditionally would have been possible. So in terms of the cloud, there are three different cloud models. Azure is an example of a public cloud. So in that solution, you don't have to worry about any real expenditure other than the pay-as-you-go of the services you consume. So as you consume, you will be billed for that, very much like you would for any other utility that you're accustomed to, such as water or something of that nature. You only pay for what you utilize. Whereas with private cloud, that would be, as I mentioned, procuring of expensive hardware, places to keep that, cooling, management and maintenance of all that stuff, and then hybrid cloud, where you have a bit of both, where you utilize cloud services and where necessary utilize private cloud or on-prem services where it makes sense, maybe to meet customer or compliance obligations, or just because of performance or something that just makes it make more sense to have that running on-prem than in the cloud. In terms of service models, there are three of them. The first one and the most simple one is infrastructure as a service, IaaS. You've probably heard this term being thrown about a bit. In an IaaS model, you are simply procuring a virtual machine or a service within your cloud provider, which is where you worry about the storage and the networking, the underlying operating system, but the cloud provider is providing the actual physical infrastructure, such as the storage, the networking, the physical data center. All of that is taken care of by, in this case, Azure, but you're providing the operating system. That is your responsibility. You're managing and maintaining that solution, but the benefit of that, it is the most it provides the most benefit, the most flexibility, should I say. In terms of PaaS, platform as a service, that is a step up from IaaS, where the underlying operating system and tools, the middleware, the runtime libraries, that is all provided as part of the PaaS service. So an example could be something like a Azure App Service, where instead of running a virtual machine with IaaS or Apache to provide a web application, you're utilizing App Service and making use of that service rather than a virtual machine, rather than having to worry about managing and maintaining the runtime libraries, the IaaS and the operating system. Instead, you just worry about provisioning the service itself and worrying about making sure the service is adequate for your users. SaaS is something that you're probably quite well aware of. SaaS is software as a service, and it is where you are procuring a solution from a vendor where you don't have to worry about any of the other underlying stuff, such as what we mentioned with PaaS and SaaS, but also you have less flexibility with that solution. So you're bounded by what the solution is. Examples such as Office 365, so Exchange Online, for example, you have a very much boxed in solution for what is available to you to be able to provide to your users compared to, say, an on-prem traditional Exchange solution. In terms of a comparison of those service models, you have IaaS, which is the most flexible. You have PaaS, which allows you to focus on the solution that you're providing to your customers, and then SaaS, which allows you to quickly provision a solution which is specifically designed for a specific purpose. What you'll notice is as you move from IaaS to PaaS through to SaaS solutions, when you are procuring these, by moving across from IaaS to PaaS and SaaS, you not only gain the benefit of not having to worry about the underlying platform, it also provides you the opportunity to start focusing more on the service that is being provided and the solution that you're providing, rather than worrying about managing and maintaining the underlying platforms which they built upon. In terms of the responsibility model, so each of the service models has a varying level of responsibility, part of which is the onus on yourself and part of which is on, in this case, Azure, Microsoft. So traditionally, obviously, you'd be providing and managing and maintaining the entire solution, whereas in infrastructure as a service, you're just not worrying about the compute, networking, and storage side, as we mentioned previously. But the actual virtual machine, as an example, the operating system, everything that's running on top of that, you're now still responsible for. But that does give you the flexibility of making sure that you can control that. Once you move over to platform as a service, you're taking less responsibility for the solution, but you also have a slightly less flexibility. But assuming the platform as a service selected for the task at hand meets your requirements, then all you need to really do is worry about the application that you're developing, the solution you're deploying, the data and the access to that. Whereas with software as a service, you're not worrying about anything except for the data and the access. There are a number of advantages to utilizing cloud services. We're going to mention 6 over 2 slides. So high availability is that ability to benefit to make sure that everything is running and making sure that downtimes and outages are as minimized as possible. Some solutions that you provide within the cloud will need to be configured for, or can be configured for higher availability natively. Other solutions need to be developed for it. So it really depends on what you're trying to do there. In terms of scalability, that is the ability to add and remove resources as required. So vertically allowing, say, a virtual machine to go from one size to another size without it really having to worry about making sure that the underlying hardware and platform is actually capable of adding more CPU, RAM, whatever to a virtual machine, for example, and then horizontally where you can add multiple of those instances of a resource. So if you have a virtual machine which is running a solution, if you can then replicate that and have multiple versions of that with maybe a load balancer sitting in front of that as a solution for scalability, that is possible in the cloud very easily, given the fact that you don't have to worry about the underlying infrastructure that is provided by Azure. In terms of elasticity, that is quite similar to scalability and related to scalability, where the solutions provided, some of the solutions provided by the native PaaS services will provide auto scaling. So where a solution will consume less resource when needed and more resources in terms of in those peak times when traffic will be increased. Agility is that ability to be able to procure those resources on demand when you need them, and then if you don't need them, no longer have them, sometimes referred to as snoozing. Geo-distribution, obviously that is taking advantage of the nature of the hyperscalers, such as Azure, where wherever you want to procure a solution because your users are in that particular country, Microsoft more than likely nowadays has a region that is close to that user to ensure that latency is kept to a minimum and performance is optimized. Disaster recovery, so natively Microsoft will provide a number of solutions to help with disaster recovery. Some of them are baked into some services, some of them are optional extras that you can add on if you require them. So in Azure, the consumption model is a pay-as-you-use, utility-based model. You never have to pre-purchase something. It's always the case that you're paying for what you use as you use it. So the more you use, the more you pay. And if you don't need a resource, you can get rid of that resource and not be committed to that unless you go that model. In terms of moving to the cloud, there are a number of ways of taking potentially users on that journey from existing solutions that are on-prem into a more cloud-native approach. So depending on the customer's requirements, there's options for rehosting, also known as lifting and shifting, where you literally take what is available on-prem. So if they've got a virtual machine, say domain controller or something similar to that, you can migrate that across to the cloud and run that in the cloud with very little changes required. It's very flexible in that terms of migration model, but it can also incur the most cost because running multiple virtual machines as you did on-prem may not be necessary as you move into a cloud model. So that's where we start looking at things such as refactoring, where if you have a solution, for example, a solution that requires a SQL database in the back end, instead of running a dedicated virtual machine for that or a set of virtual machines for that SQL database, you can then make use of the cloud native solutions, the PaaS solutions, and that might just require some minimal changes to either the code if you have access to that or configuration if it's more of a commercial application that you're utilizing. As long as the solution supports the versions of databases in the cloud, then obviously that can work as well. So you could potentially have a line of business application, which is, say, a front-end server and a back-end database. That solution can move where the front-end server moves as a virtual machine, and maybe that back-end database is migrated and refactored into a PaaS option. Re-architect then goes into that next step, that being able to do a bit more with that. Usually requires changes to the code base to make use of more cloud-native approaches. And then rebuild is where you start looking at, okay, we have an application, it's old and crusty, and it's time to actually now look at how do we rebuild that into a cloud-native approach, taking advantage of more modern and cloud-native technologies and techniques, such as SQL Server Managed Instance, Azure Functions, maybe some cognitive service, some AI, and microservices over, say, Azure Fabric or something of that nature. So, we'll next discuss some of the Azure resources. We're not going to go through absolutely everything because there is a lot. Azure can be quite a behemoth, but we'll select some solutions and services which we find a lot of our customers use quite regularly. So in terms of size and scale of Azure as a provider, they are currently 60 plus Azure regions, and we'll discuss. And each of these dots that you can see on the screen is either an existing region or a forthcoming region. Most of our customers are usually more concerned around the UK South and UK West regions, with Europe West and Europe North situated in just outside of Amsterdam and just outside of Dublin being secondary locations that we find our customers use quite regularly. Now, each of these regions may have some differences to them in terms of what is available in terms of resources. Sometimes that has to do with the age of the date of the region. Sometimes it has to do with just what has been provided by Microsoft in those regions. So for example, something that's a little bit older, like Europe North and Europe West, those tend to have a lot more of the older generation, say, virtual machines, whilst some of the newest, the latest, say, South Africa West, they might not have the oldest generation of virtual machines. So there's sometimes a disparity between them, and sometimes there's also a cost disparity between how much things cost in each region. So sometimes if you don't have that requirement to focus on a particular region for a customer, if a customer does have the option to run stuff outside of, say, UK South, UK West, because there's no compliance issues or business requirements to keep it within the UK, then sometimes, especially things like storage, Europe West and Europe North might be significantly cheaper. So we have the concept of geographies, regions, and availability zones. So a region I've mentioned in the previous slide. A region is a set of data centers within a country or an area, a geographical location. A region comprises of multiple, one or more data centers. In some instances, it's only one. Generally, it's more than one, and that allows those data centers to communicate with each other in high speed, and they also, each data center can then be considered a bit of a failure domain. So above that, we then have the concept of a geography. A geography nowadays tends to be a country, such as the UK, France, Germany, and each of those geographies will then have at least one Azure region. Those Azure regions are generally paired, so there's generally two or more within a geography, and they'll usually nowadays, especially in more recent deployments, there'll usually be a primary and a secondary. So for example, in France, the primary is France Central, and then you can use the paired site if you're a customer of France Central. The UK, that's not the case, and nor is that the case for Europe West and North. An availability zone is a region which has multiple data centers, more than 3, and each availability zone tends to be one or more data centers. Each of those zones, those in the availability zones, is an independent failure domain. So if anything goes wrong within one of the zones within a availability zone, it doesn't affect any of the other remaining zones. That allows you to ensure that if you build your solution correctly within the availability zone, that ensures that you have that fault tolerance and high availability when things do happen to go wrong. Recently, you may be aware that UK South did have a bit of an outage where there was a cooling issue in one of the data centers. And for those customers who had built up their solutions to take advantage of availability zones, their solutions would have continued running in the remaining availability zones had they designated that. We did have a few customers that had not taken advantage of availability zones, even though they were in UK South. Unfortunately, that's one thing I can make a recommendation of, is definitely take advantage of availability zones where they are available. Availability zones aren't available in each region. I believe right now there's only 14 regions. UK South is one of them. UK West is not, for example. So going on to resources, there is a hierarchy to resources within Azure, and I've got a diagram here showing that hierarchy. I've listed them in the order from the bottom up. So resources are, just your things that you're going to provision within Azure. So be that a virtual machine, a network, a SQL database, whatever the case may be, all those resources will sit within Azure, and those will sit within a resource group. That resource group is that logical container. You can think of it like a folder, or if you're familiar with Active Directory and OU, it is a boundary for that solution. It can be used as a administrative boundary, and groups like solutions. So if you're building up a solution for a HR department, for example, everything for that solution can sit within one resource group, and only the people who require access to that resource group to manage and maintain that solution can be granted access at that level. Sitting above resource groups, we then have subscriptions, and that's where you can have you can have multiple subscriptions, and each subscription is a billing boundary and an administrative boundary. So you could have a subscription for production, so your main stuff that all your users are going to use. You could then have one or more additional subscriptions, which may be for dev, for test, or you might have a situation where you might have a production environment for most of your solutions, but maybe you've got another subscription which is dedicated to a particular solution, maybe because it's co-managed by a third party or solution provided by a third party. Those all sit within the customer's tenant. Above that, you can then make use of management groups, and management groups allow you to provide policies and compliance across multiple subscriptions so that you can easily maintain those subscriptions. If you think about it, it's quite similar to having multiple OUs and setting, say, group policies at a higher level and then waiting for that to inherit down. Management groups, you tend to have a root management group, and then you can have up to 6 levels of management groups within that, so you can actually create quite complex management structures before you even get to the subscriptions, the resource groups and resources underneath them. In terms of management, everything works through something called Azure Resource Manager. So if you've ever used Azure at all, you may have gone onto the portal. So that uses the ARM, the Azure Resource Manager. If you want to run PowerShell scripts or any other scripting, again, that's going through the ARM. And the ARM handles things such as authentication, access to the resources, and provision of resources. To ensure that you have those management features. Okay, so some of the compute services which are available, obviously basic ones such as virtual machines, those can be Windows or Linux. There are requirements for supportable versions of Windows and Linux that are available, and that's all documented by Microsoft. Linux VMs support does reach back quite a while. I think it's kernel 2.4 and onwards. If you're familiar with containerization, then the Azure Kubernetes system, service allows you to create a cluster of those containers, which effectively run on top of virtual machines. And then you have something called Azure Functions. Azure Functions being a serverless compute solution, which is event-driven. So this is a more modernized version computing solution. So, for example, in the past, you may have had a script run on a schedule to do some sort of management task. This could potentially replace that. Instead of having a virtual machine running a script dedicated to that task, like I've had in the past on-prem, you could literally just have a function which is called on schedule or by some sort of other event, just to make sure that that runs. Or you can even build up applications purely out of Azure Functions in a serverless compute environment. The great thing about Azure Functions and the serverless compute concept is that it does cost very little in order to be able to run a single instance of that function. So some examples of some virtual machines. These are just some that we see regularly that our customers utilize often. The three that I would call out mainly are the B series, mainly because the B series is quite cheap. They're very useful for testing purposes. I wouldn't necessarily recommend them for production purposes unless you know how burstable CPUs work in terms of their CPU utilization. I would definitely highly recommend reading up on the burstable B series CPUs and how they allocate CPU resources, and hence the reason why they are so cheap. But if you're doing something like maybe a domain controller or something that's not going to be utilized frequently, or the workload that it runs is not going to be great, then it might be worthwhile to utilize burstable within production. But we tend to recommend either the DV3 or EV3 VMs for production environments. Those tend to be just general purpose style solutions, so they can handle pretty much anything, and they can handle up to 64 virtual CPUs, as you can see here. So in most cases, more service resources than usually required. There are also newer versions. There's now DV4 and EV4 VMs. Currently, that's not available in all regions. I'd still recommend DV3. There is a slight cost benefit for going for DV3 versus DV4. There's also AMD-based solutions where all these ones that are shown on screen at the moment are actually Intel-based server options, and those can have a different costing options. You will find that the main difference between a DV3 and an EV3 is just the amount of RAM that is allocated per CPU. The EV3 tends to have twice as much, except for the larger size, which of 64 cores. That's the only real difference. In terms of networking, whenever you provision a virtual machine, for example, you are going to be required to have a virtual network. That is just a very basic networking solution within Azure, and allows for a private network within Azure that is, unless you expose it to the outside world, it is perfectly private, and only resources that you provide and allow access to that network will have access to it. It's very much like having a switch that is just not connected to anything else in terms of on-prem equivalent. Other options that are available in networking, there are many others beyond these three. Azure load balancers, I mentioned earlier, you could potentially have virtual machines that for a solution as a backend, and if you just need a layer 4 based load balancer, then the native load balancer that is supplied within Azure is a very affordable option, and there's actually a free option as well. That's extremely basic. Beyond that, what we also see that customers tend to find useful is the Azure Application Gateway. If you are creating solutions, web solutions, which are being exposed to the outside world, you may have a requirement to do some layer 7 based load balancing. So for example, if you want to have part of your application, say /images from the URL, point to a particular set of virtual machines or backend infrastructure, you could point it to that. You can have another set of, say for videos, you could have that point to something else. And those can actually be different solutions in the backend. One could be VMs, one could be app service, for example. There's no requirement there to standardize across that. And the other thing that that's great about the Azure Application Gateway, it also has the option to include a web application firewall, and that is based on the CRS 3.1 of the OWASP. So that just provides, if I remember, 11 basic rules that for things like SQL injection and that sort of stuff, and avoids that in your web apps. In terms of connectivity, there are two primary ways of getting access between, say, an on-prem solution. Say if you have an office for a customer and you need to connect that into Azure, the most common is something like a site-to-site connection that requires a Azure VPN gateway and a solution on-prem which can make that connection. So that's a site-to-site, and obviously given how times are at the moment, you might find that users remotely need to connect in, so that's where point-to-site VPN connection. And a single VPN gateway can actually handle both a point-to-site and a site-to-site connection. Depending on the tier of that or the SKU of that VPN gateway will determine how many it can actually handle and how many are included in the base cost. Beyond that, you then have ExpressRoute. So unlike a VPN gateway, which goes over the public internet, an ExpressRoute is actually a private connection, a dedicated connection between an infrastructure and Microsoft Azure or Microsoft's edge routers. So that is something that you need to acquire through a acquire in connection with a connectivity provider. So the service provider might be able to handle that. Somebody like Equinix or somebody like that might be able to provide that. And then you need to create that Azure ExpressRoute resource in Azure and have that configured to work with the solution provided by the that network provider. That happens over layer 3, and it's basically works as a number of different solutions, but normal any-to-any IP-based network is possible, as are various other options. The other thing about the edge network it does comprise of at least 2 distinct connections into the Microsoft solution. So you do have a high availability, so you have more reliability over ExpressRoute than potentially a VPN gateway. In terms of storage, there are a few options. Blob storage is quite common. It is an object storage solution in the cloud. If you're familiar with AWS, it's similar to their object-based storage. Objects can be provisioned on different tiers of storage. So there's hot, cool, and archive, and it's great for lots of unstructured data. So if there's just a whole bunch of files, large files, or millions of very small files, all of that can migrate into blob storage, but it is an object-based storage. It isn't easily accessible by users in a traditional SMB-based storage. There are solutions around that, but if you need SMB-based storage, that's where we start looking at Azure files. The other thing about Azure Blob, I mentioned archive. That is a very affordable way to keep lots of data for long-term storage. So where in the past you might have looked at utilizing, say, tape or hard drives to move data off a network, off a NAS or a SAN solution, Azure Blob could be an alternative to that. The only concern there is getting that data into the cloud, but something like Azure Blob archive storage is as little as £1.50 or something per terabyte per month in the UK. Very affordable storage. And then Azure Files is basically a file share in the cloud. So you provision a share of a certain size, and users can access that using normal SMB or NFS protocols from a Windows, Linux, or a Mac OS machine. And that works pretty well. There are also different tiers provided for that. So there's a premium storage, which is quite expensive, but very high performance. There's another tier below that, which is now known as transaction optimized. And then recently, Microsoft's announced a hot tier and a cool tier. Those 2 tiers are significantly cheaper than transaction optimized, used to be known as standard. But they have additional costs in terms of access and other charges, but this does usually work out significantly cheaper than transaction optimized. And then lastly, we have Azure Managed Disks. These are the disks that you will utilize for virtual machines. So if you're familiar with VMware or Hyper-V, same sort of concept, but these are 100% managed by Microsoft, and these can also be presented on multiple tiers. I mentioned premium SSD and standard SSD tiers, but there's also an ultra SSD, and then there's also a standard hard drive, which is really affordable for larger storage, should you require it in a VM. In terms of encryption, the Azure Storage encryption service will manage the encryption of the data onto the disks that Microsoft supplies. So what's physically located within Azure's data centers will be encrypted at rest. And then if you're utilizing a virtual machine, for example, you can actually encrypt the data within that virtual machine as well, be it Windows or Linux, either one it supports. So you can actually ensure that the solutions that you provide are encrypted, and this also applies to other services that Microsoft provides. So the data that is sitting on Microsoft's hardware is not easily accessible to people who have access to the physical hardware. For storage, we also have a number of options in terms of redundancy and replication. So within Microsoft's infrastructure, they don't use traditional RAID solutions. So instead, they keep multiple copies of data. And the most affordable and most common option is to use LRS, locally redundant storage. So that is where 3 copies of the data is kept within this particular region. The next step up from that, if you do have access to an availability zone, is ZRS storage, so zone redundant storage, where again, it's 3 replicas, but each replica is kept in a different zone. That ensures that if one zone goes down, at least you still have access to your data. Whereas with LRS, if a zone goes down, there's a possibility that you'll lose access to your data. ZRS is slightly more expensive than LRS, but that's part of the course. The next level up from that is GRS. So GRS takes LRS and just replicates that to a secondary region. Usually that would be that region pair that I mentioned previously, but you can actually have that replicated to pretty much any region, and that happens asynchronously. And that means that you'll have effectively 3 replicas in one location and 3 replicas in another location. So should something go wrong, such as I mentioned in UK South, where you had that outage, if you hadn't made use of ZRS, then you could have, and you're making use of GRS, you could have failover to that secondary location. Another option just above that is read access GRS storage. So that's where you can read and write to the primary storage like you can with GRS, but not only do you get that secondary synchronization across to that secondary site, you can actually read from that location as well. So if you have a solution that's say deployed in UK South and you replicating to UK West, for some reason, if you need a solution to be able to read from both locations because you have users that get better performance from reading from UK West, then you can actually have a solution which allows them to read from that, but you won't be able to write to that secondary location. Microsoft has also recently made available 2 other levels of redundancy above this, which is ZGRS, which is a zonal global redundant storage. So combining the concepts of zone redundant storage and global redundant storage. So it goes from one zone of ZRS and replicas to another ZRS location. And then you have the read access version of that. So cost optimization. So once you've been playing around with Azure and you have a number of solutions available, there are some ways to mitigate some of the costs that you will incur. And one of them is Azure Reserved Instances. And Azure Reserved Instance is a specific type of Azure reservation, which is a commitment to a resource for a particular period of time. So for a reserved instance, if you're going for virtual machines, this is a great way to reduce that cost quite dramatically, potentially, based on committing to the resource for 1 or 3 years. That requires you to know what type of virtual machine you want. So in the example here, we have a v3, and you need to know where that's going to be. So the reservation is placed in a region for a particular type of virtual machine, and then for a particular period of time, so 12 months or 36 months. And this allows you to ensure that you can run that resource for that period of time, especially if it's something that you know that you're going to run for a protracted period of time. I've mentioned a domain controller. So in that example, if you were to run a domain controller for 1 or 3 years because you know you're going to be utilizing Active Directory as your IDP for the foreseeable future, then it would make sense to go and say, okay, well, that's a domain controller. We'll provide a virtual machine reservation for that, and we'll commit to it for 1 or 3 years. The great thing about reservations is there is some flexibility with them. So the reservation doesn't apply to a specific virtual machine. It applies to that SKU of virtual machine within that region. So as long as there's a virtual machine that is available to be utilized by that reservation, it will automatically apply. So for example, if in the example of the D4v3, if you had a number of virtual machines of that same size, and you only had one reservation, and that's applying to, say, that's a line of business application, for example. If that line of business application is turned off or decommissioned or whatever, it will automatically now apply to one of the remaining VMs of the same size. So you'll always get the best utilization possible out of that reservation, and that will automatically apply within your costings. One thing to remember is the reservation only applies to the compute aspect of the virtual machine. So if you're running a Windows virtual machine on top of that, you'll still have a line item for the operating system. So you can reassign that. You can also exchange. So should you have a situation where you have one virtual machine of a particular size that maybe you've realized after time that you need to scale up that solution, and now you want that reservation is for a smaller size SKU, now you need to get a larger SKU, it is possible to exchange the existing reservation to affect the larger size. The only requirement really for an exchange is that the outstanding balance value has to be greater, the reservation that you wish to purchase has to be of greater value than the outstanding commitment for that RI. So if you are paying, say, £100 a month, for example, for a 1-year reservation, and 6 months down the line, you realize that you actually need to go to a £200 a month reservation, all you need to do is ensure that £600 is less than, in this case, the £2,400 of the new reservation. When you create that new reservation or do that exchange, the new reservation starts on the date that you create that reservation. You also have the option of canceling a reservation, and then that might incur a small cost. Usually, I believe 12% at the moment, and that is prorated based on the outstanding commitment. If you or your customers are going to use virtual machines or Windows Server or SQL Server licenses, services within Azure, there is the option to make use of Azure Hybrid Benefits. Azure Hybrid Benefits applies to Windows Server and Windows SQL Server licenses with active software assurance. It allows you to bring those licenses from your on-prem and bring it to the cloud, allowing you to save quite substantial amounts. And this can be included with your reservations to bring down the cost of virtual machines or SQL services down to a bare minimum. So in terms of governance and security, we're just going to touch on some of these. So some of the challenges that we face in environments, especially when moving to the cloud, is how do we manage who has access to virtual machines? How do we limit who can do what within the environment, such as limiting specific users to only being able to create specific SKUs of VMs? Making sure that we understand what resources have been provisioned and what they apply to. Because once you start moving to the cloud, everything that you're provisioning has a cost, and it's good to understand quickly what all those services are. So if you're creating a service for the HR department, and it would be good to have, say, a service tag in place to make sure that all the resources aligned to that that department or that cost code, to that project, are easily identifiable. That then will have some additional benefits later on when it really goes through the Quantum portal. So one of the things that we have in place is role-based access control. You could think of this as quite similar to Azure Active Directory-based administrative roles. You have a set of predefined roles available within Azure, and you can create custom roles. So you can see on this, we have some of the basic ones, such as reader, contributor, and owner, and that will apply to various different types of resources. So you could potentially have, say, virtual machine owner, and for some users, and then say contributor for others, and maybe if you just require some people just to be able to see that their virtual machine's there, then the reader role. So RBAC can allow you to restrict what actions are performed by what users, ensuring that you can control who can do what and see what in a particular area. So for example, we mentioned the departmental-based resource group in the past. You could allow access to that departmental access, that resource group for certain users. They can have certain level of privileges within there, but maybe not the same level of privileges within another resource group, and vice versa. You could potentially, for example, have first-line access across all different resource groups assigned to certain users, and then third-line access or second-line access added as required across those. The other thing that we have access that Microsoft provides is something called policies. Policies enforce those standards and allow you to assess the compliance in a large scale. And the great thing is you can see this within the dashboard quite easily. You can see some examples that we've provided there. So say ensuring that passwords are set to a certain strength, for example, making sure that only certain resource locations are allowed. So for example, you could only allow resources within a subscription to be created within UK South and UK West. You could enforce certain resource tags, for example, department codes or cost codes, project, maybe even when that solution will need to be decommissioned, say like a decommission tag. So that can all be enforced, and that can be enforced at various levels. And then obviously on the use cases that we see for this is to ensure the consistency and compliance, helping maintain that security and allowing you to enforce your costs and apply management procedures across that. In terms of compliance and trust, obviously Microsoft is working to make sure that it is trusted and compliant with as many regulations as possible, and will help you make sure that your solutions meet those requirements as well, in terms of the fact that the underlying platform has been provided to adhere to those to that. The solutions that you create on top of Microsoft platforms won't automatically necessarily be compliant. You still need to make sure that anything that you provide on top of that solution. So if you have a virtual machine, for example, just because Azure is trusted by EU model clauses doesn't necessarily mean that the solution that you provide within that VM is automatically adherent to that. You will still need to make sure that things that you provide on top of Microsoft resources are adherent to the things that you need to adhere to, but at least the underlying platform itself adheres to those solutions and those regulations. So finally, a few more slides. One thing that I find very useful for our partners has been Azure Lighthouse. Azure Lighthouse is a free solution that Microsoft offers to enable that multi-tenant management. So as a provider to multiple Azure partners, you will then be able to manage those customers' environments. They can give you access if that's how they want to do it, or if it's through, say, CSP or something, you already have potentially administrative access over the entire CSP subscription. This will allow you to manage those from a single interface. So rather than having credentials which have to be for each of those subscriptions for those customer tenants, you will just have your users log into your tenant, and then they'll be able to access those customer tenants that they've been given, those customer subscriptions they've been given access to. So a customer can actually, if they're not through, say, CSP, through, say, maybe an EA, they can actually delegate out access at a subscription level. They could potentially do it at a resource level or resource group level, and then you'll see those resources that you have access to manage and maintain. Another thing that I find very useful for our partners is the cloud adoption framework. So the cloud adoption framework is a huge resource of information that allows you to provide and implement technologies and strategies as you migrate into the cloud or start fresh in the cloud. So you'll see under the adopt area, there's migrate and then innovate. Innovate is where you're starting fresh, and migrate is obviously when you're moving from the on-prem to the cloud. The documentation does also include non-technical aspects to the migration process, business techniques and concepts that might be useful for the rest of the business, for your customers to have to buy into. And then also some best practices, tools, and documentation on top of that. Obviously, it's useful to keep learning. This has been a whirlwind overview of stuff that's available within the Azure Fundamentals course, which is available at that link over there. I would also highly recommend, if possible, to do the Azure Fundamentals course. Now, the fundamentals isn't just something I would recommend to technical people. If you have account managers and whatnot, I would recommend that they also do it if they're going to be selling and understanding it. It's not a very technical, in-depth course. It's a lot more breadth about the solution and what is available and what is the art of possible. One thing I have found is these virtual training days. If you go onto that link provided there, you will find that Microsoft, at last I looked at least, are offering a free fundamentals training course, 2 half days. And if you do that course, you'll be given access to a free voucher to write the exam. So that might prove quite useful. So I'd just like to thank you for your time. I'm going to now hand over to Maria, who will go through the Quantum portal for you. Maria.
Great stuff. All right, there we go. I was just waiting for the show my screen. So there we go. Give me 1 second. Right. Good afternoon. My name's Maria Singleton. I work in the services team at Bytes, and I work alongside both Imran and Brandon as a kind of resource to kind of call on to articulate some of these services that we provide, supporting customers and partners around Azure and 365 and various other tool sets as well. What I'll show you today is our Power BI toolset that provides customers and partners visibility of spend within Azure. So just probably worthwhile noting that effectively all we do is we connect into an API key. We then extract all of the billing information, and then we run a certain amount of analytics against that and present them in that presentation layer within Power BI. So we technically could provide customized reports around some of that information, as long as it is present within the billing information. So what I'm going to show you today is pretty much vanilla. It's kind of a standard flavor that we provide to all of our customers and partners. But if we want any customization around this, then that is possible. We'd need to really just scope that activity. So another thing to note, as soon as I log into this, the toolset itself uses a customer's MFA sort of credentials. So if I log into this, I'll get a 6-digit code that's sent back to my mobile phone, and then I authenticate using that. So it's quite safe in that respect. Standard Power BI capabilities available on this. If you bear with me 1 second. For some reason, the panel is covering off that little section. If you give me 1 moment. So if I go to full screen, just to kind of show the information a little bit easier, I'll move that out of the way. So as you'll notice straight away, I've got some information here about when the report was generated. The information in here can be up to 3 days out of date, but that's kind of a Microsoft billing kind of peculiarity. This is taking data on a nightly basis, so that actually the information we've got in here is pretty much up to date. It's just that sometimes Microsoft's billing data lags behind by up to 3 days. We notice the currency information at the start of the document. We don't have any reference to currency further through the document itself or through the report. And you'll notice on the right-hand side there are a number of filters that will start to appear within the tool set as I go through the report itself. And at the bottom we have various different tabs which I'll go through one by one just to sort of highlight the kind of information that you can see within this. So the first area to note, if I go to the summary information, waiting for it to refresh. So it provides me with a high-level view of my Azure consumption. We can have multiple APIs in here as well, and so I could potentially have quite a kind of long-term view of my subscription, and it also gives me that ability then over the term of that agreement to see any peaks or troughs in the consumption levels that I have. It gives me a view of my top 3 consuming services. It'll also give me a blow-by-blow account for the last number of months, and also make a forecast on future months. In terms of it provides a heat map that gives me a view of where I'm consuming services. So when Brandon was talking about particular policies that you need to adhere to, this will quite quickly show you if you're actually consuming services outside of the UK or if outside a region that you're restricted to. And also true to form from a Power BI perspective, it wouldn't be right unless we had a word wall, but it gives us that sort of information presented to us. So this is our entire Azure consumption under the APIs that have been included within this report. We can refine that further by going to cost management. And this allows us then, and probably the most useful area for partners, it gives us that ability to then sort of double check and navigate through various sets of data to understand where we've got peaks in the data set. So we can see the longevity of the agreements that we've got. It also provides us a forecast if it's under EA. And I can then slice and dice this data either by using a date range. I can manually adjust that date range if I need to. I can look at specific months if I need to do that, because I've spotted that there is some peculiarity in the data sets that I'm looking at below. And more importantly, I can then look at subscription information as well. And so typically if we have multiple customers in here, we would have different subscription names. Probably Imran will provide a bit more detail around that a bit later on. But it's a really good place for me to then just to start navigating through the data. For each of the kind of services, I can drill down into the information into more detail. So I can do that either by navigating through the sort of graphical view of that, or I can utilize any of the filters that I've got on the right-hand side. Worth noting as well, so this would cover EA and CSP as well. And we can look at multiple tenants. So I've got different tenant information in there. And if we want specific dates to actually interrogate the data, we can look at that as well. Moving on, we've talked about the various assets that we've got within the estate. This just gives me a view of what that looks like. So from a subscription, I can find out all of the details around sort of resource types, the number of resources that I've got, and the consumption and the costs associated to those as well. And again, I can filter on the right-hand side. So I can scroll through this if I want to go through and pick out specific subscriptions, or I can put in the search for that particular subscription or resource name, or I can use the filters that are available to me on the right-hand side. And again, if we're using tags as well, we could potentially look at tag names as well to refine the data if we're trying to kind of understand a specific cost associated to that. From an infrastructure perspective, so we're talking about the virtual machines that we have deployed within the estate. This gives me an overall view of what that looks like. I can see in here actually that these machines are pretty much on full time as well. So what we would see when these are being switched off on a nightly basis is a lot more sort of drops in the graphs that we're looking at here. So this just gives us a representation of the consumption of those, how long those machines are actually, or the infrastructure is actually up for the uptime effectively. I can then look at a breakdown from a monthly cost. So if I want to start tracking those subscriptions and how much that's costing me, this gives me a view over a set period of time, so the term of that contract so far, and I can then look at I can either scroll through that data to find the subscription that I'm interested in, to work out what that's been costing me on a month-by-month basis, and it gives me the totals on the right-hand side. Or again, I can use the filters that are available to me on the right-hand side, and also I can take some date ranges as well. So if I'm only interested in a particular period, I can refine that so that I'm only looking at a particular period in time to review the consumption for those subscriptions. From a resource tracker perspective, again, very similarly, it will give me some information. In this particular case, we don't actually have any deployed in the last 7 days, but I can look at any new resources that have been deployed. I get an overall view of the cost of those resources. And again, I can either scroll through on a month-by-month basis or pick out specific resources, or I can, let me just clear that, or I can just scroll down so I can find the particular one resource group that I'm interested in and then review that in its isolation. Or I can utilize some of the filters that are available to me on the right-hand side. Okay, if I'm utilizing tags, so I can see all of my consumption over time, but if I'm using tags to identify key projects or particular kind of silos within my infrastructure, and I've created tags associated to those, if I have those in here, I can then just click on a tag and the data will dynamically change to represent that specific, the components of that, so I can see what the resources are and so on. And again, I have the ability to just scroll through to find particular areas that I'm interested in, or I can refine that view by using the filters on the right-hand side. So that covers off tags. We mentioned, or certainly Brandon mentioned, resource that there are opportunities to make some savings within Azure using something called reserved instance. So within the tool set itself and hybrid benefit as well. So just to recap, so reserved instance are effectively forward purchasing the resources. So there are certain kind of considerations as part of that, as Brandon outlined earlier. Within the tool set, we provide some sort of high-level recommendations around opportunities to make cost savings by application of reserved instance and hybrid benefit. Now, when we go into these, so you can get them for a 1 year or 3 year reserved instance, and if we look at that, for instance, it will first of all give me a sort of high level view to say there's 130 machines that could contribute to saving of, and it'll provide the savings. So the costings that we're applying here, or the savings we're articulating here, are all relative to pay as you go. It will also give me a summary up the top here, and I can review all of those instances to understand whether or not I think it's appropriate to apply reserved instances to these subscriptions or to these resources. Now, one of the things that we've added in here as well is adding a sanity check against what the break-even month would be. So, for instance, I'd need to leave this machine running for 7 months before I'd then start saving money. So in the 8th month, relative to pay as you go, I'm actually saving money. And likewise, if we want to look at or consider what would happen if we were to cancel reserved instance, there is an at-risk month. Given that you would be charged, I think it was 12% of the as part of a kind of cancellation of a reserved instance, you would have to leave that instance running, or that resource running, for at least 2 months to break even. So that's what the sort of at-risk month is in terms of the costs. So to recoup that 12% that you would be charged, you'd have to leave that machine running for at least 2 months. So it provides all of that detail within the report. We do actually provide additional services to support kind of navigating through that, because if we're looking at particularly large Azure footprints, it can become quite a challenge to actually review this information and align it with the sort of organizational strategy, whether or not, you know, and kind of go through this on a monthly basis. It is kind of time consuming. So we do provide 2 levels of service. One is an advisory service to review this information, and then provides a kind of reports against, you know, what our recommendations are and potential cost savings. But we also provide an additional level as well, where we can actually go in and apply those reserved instances and hybrid benefits and make the changes as well as required. Just going back to the previous tab, when we're looking at hybrid benefit, it will provide a very similar recommendation, although in this instance that all the hybrid benefit has been applied, so there's no additional hybrid benefit available. When I'd look at this, if I wanted just to review that, I've got my current RIs. So once I have chosen machines and instances to apply reserved instance to, it will then track those for you and give you a utilization rating as well within here. So as part of the sort of activities we'd undertake, first of all, there are opportunities to make savings, but ongoing, you then need to make sure that they are still appropriate given the level of utilization of those machines. So this is the area where we'd be able to refine that and have a look at that. The advisory service provides that kind of sanity check as well, and provides then navigates through the options that are available to you around whether or not you can exchange or cancel or reassign those reserved instances elsewhere. Likewise with hybrid benefit, ongoing, I can see all of the kind of utilization, where I've used them, and also the sort of months and years against the resource names and how I've applied those and the utilization of those machines themselves. And again, it's an ongoing process really to make sure that you review the utilization of the machines we've applied hybrid benefit to, because we can see there's an awful lot within this particular example where actually we're getting no utilization, and it might be that these these hybrid benefits are better utilized on the machines. In this particular case, we've said that there isn't any additional optimization available. However, that's something that would be a consideration if we saw some additional optimization recommendations coming through for newly deployed resources. It gives us a high-level view of the costs associated to that, and the number of Windows Server licenses. A point to note that it is actually very straightforward to apply hybrid benefit, but you really do need to make sure that you have the appropriate level of licenses with software assurance, active software assurance, to cover off, particularly if you're in a hybrid environment. So you'll need to make sure that you've got enough of those to cover off both on-prem and cloud requirements, and that's something that Imran would be able to support you with and help you navigate through as well. And that is the quantum for Azure. Hopefully that's given you a flavour of the tool set, and on that I shall hand back the screen to Imran. So bear with me 1 second.
Hi Maria, thank you very much for that. Just one thing I just want to cover off as you were talking there. The Azure plan is now available in this tool for indirect CSP resellers as well as Azure Legacy. And secondly, I believe the customization is available as well per customer. So initially when the Azure plan, the quantum tool is set up, it's set up under your cost plus margin. But if you wanted to have RRP pricing to showcase to your customers, we can do that on an individual per tenant or per subscription basis, which is available upon request. And within the cost management section, as Maria was showing, it does have the name of the subscription as a SKU, but you can change that within our cloud portal. So any tenants that you have through us with their Azure subscriptions through us, you can change the name to whatever you want and it'll pull through on the report as well. So it's quite flexible what we can do on that side. And the tool, Quantum for Azure, is free for all our indirect CSP resellers as well. So I think that's pretty much me covered up.